We've spent a lot of time on this channel talking about the Oceanliner, big passenger-carrying steamships from the mid-1800s, something that, as a piece of technology, completely changed the way the world travelled. It's actually kind of hard to convey just how big a change this was. Naturally, to demonstrate things, we need to look at what life was like before the Oceanliner. Here's a spoiler alert, it's not a pretty picture. Without exaggeration, it can be said that for hundreds and hundreds of years of our history, going to sea was like rolling a dice to see if you'd make it or not. It's that dangerous out there. It was almost like going to space. I've mentioned the Loch Line a few times on the channel too. They're a favourite of mine for demonstrating this exact point. Loch Line was an experienced Scottish shipping firm that was set up in the 1860s and came to acquire a fleet of 25 then modern iron-hulled sailing ships that combined all the centuries of knowledge we'd learnt in operating sailing ships and the huge technological developments that metal hulls had brought. They were quick, they were well built, crewed by experienced hands. So it may come as something of a surprise to learn that Loch Line ended up with a shocking track record. Loch Ard, Carron, Erne, Leven, Moydart, Nevis, Rhine, Shiel, Sloy, Sonart, and Torridon were all wrecked. Loch Fyne, Lagan, Lomond, Marie, and Venecar all simply disappeared at sea, with all hands lost, presumably from storms, collisions with icebergs, or even rogue waves. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with their ships or their crews, it's just how dangerous conditions were. And we'd all kind of accepted that this was the cost of travel. There was just no other alternative, no way of actually getting across the ocean without risking your life. Sure, some lines cut corners and ran unnecessary risks, but the truth of it is that times were just tough, and in the 1800s, so many ships were lost that it's actually hard to choose which stories best explain what those risks were like. But I've picked two, and the first one in particular is chilling. The first one happened not too far from me in Australia. She was called the Cataraqui. Cataraqui was a sailing ship, a bark, built in England in 1840. She was absolutely typical of the hundreds, if not thousands of ships of that kind that were sailing to and from Australia at the time. See, in the mid-1800s, Australia was still a relatively new British colony, and the government was keen to establish more of a foothold on the continent. Assisted immigrant schemes were put into place where families seeking to establish a new life, away from the grime and muck of England's cities, could try their luck in an entirely new continent and society. There were a few downsides though, especially the trip out. The voyage to Australia was really tough, and conditions were nothing short of awful. The ships leaked and rolled violently in the high seas, and passengers not yet used to travelling at sea were sick the entire way. The decks ran thick with vomit, and passenger quarters were cramped and dimly lit. Many sailing immigrant ships simply disappeared in storms, never to be seen again. To sail to Australia was to risk your life. Cataraqui was tiny, only 138 feet or 42 metres long, and 802 tonnes. But still, in April 1845, into her decks were crowded 369 immigrants and 41 crew. 120 of the hopeful immigrants were married with families, and the ship carried 73 children. In April, she set out from Liverpool, bound for what is today Melbourne, Australia. For months, the ship laboured in rolling seas and high winds, slowly making its way under Africa, then across the Indian Ocean. Conditions were far from perfect, and one crewman even fell overboard and was lost. Approaching Australia, the crew were faced with a unique issue. This was well before the days of GPS navigation, radar, or anything like that. Bearings and navigational readings were taken from the sun and stars, and it took competent officers to translate the readings into a position on the ship's charts. After months without seeing land, knowing your exact position was extremely difficult. It's made even harder when the weather is rough or blowing a gale. The crew knew that they were approaching the south coast of Australia and plotted roughly where they thought they might make landfall. Meanwhile, down in the passenger quarters, the two ship's doctors, both brothers named Carpenter, had been hard at work. On the voyage, 5 children had been born, and 6 others had died. And such was life in the golden age of sail, when voyages took so long to complete. Cataraqui had left in April, but only began to near the southern coast of Australia in August. On the 3rd, the boisterous weather had grown into a full gale, and the ship was forced to heave to, riding the storm out, and not making any progress forward until it had passed. The passengers inside must have been tossed around and frightened witless by the pounding seas and rolling ship, but Cataraqui was designed to survive exactly this kind of treatment. But there was an issue. Conditions had been so bad that Captain C.W. Finlay had not been able to take a navigational reading for 4 days. And the ship was being battered around like a cork in a storm, and they had no idea where the shore was. And to hit it would spell absolute disaster. With seas running mountain high and the wind blowing a gale, the ship groped around in the darkness until about 4 a.m. on the morning of August 4th, when there was a terrible crash. Cataraqui had hit a reef off the shore of King Island on the approach to Port Phillip Bay. The captain and crew of Cataraqui had navigated without sighting land for weeks, if not months, to the exact point of making landfall and arriving successfully. They were only 1 day out of their destination, but instead of being able to sight land, they now ran afoul of jagged, razor-sharp rocks, and the ship ground hard, driven into the reef by the thunderous oceans. The hull immediately began to flood, and the passengers panicked. And what unfolded next almost defies description and is best told by one of the few survivors, the ship's chief mate, Guthrie. The scene of confusion and misery that ensued at this awful period, it is almost impossible to describe. All the passengers attempted to rush on deck, and many succeeded in doing so until the ladders were knocked away by the workings of the vessel, when the shrieks from men, women and children from below were terrific, calling on the watch on deck to assist them. The crew were actually mostly up on deck at the time of the collision and immediately got to work. Because the ladders leading up and out of the passenger quarters onto the deck were knocked away, the crew began to tie ropes and haul passengers out bodily, one by one. It was a mammoth effort, but in the end they got a few hundred up on deck. But escaping the flooding hull was one thing. The upper decks offered no shelter from the raging sea. Waves broke over the ship and swept passengers away in their dozens. At 5 a.m., just an hour after the grounding, the ship rolled totally onto her port side, with huge waves roaring down the ship's deck and washing away the lifeboats, spars, and even part of the ship's superstructure. The captain, crew, and any remaining passengers held on for dear life, and Captain Finlayson ordered that the masts should be cut away to try to right the vessel. Somehow the crew managed to do it. The masts were all cut off, but despite this heroic effort, the Cataraqui was stuck fast on its side. Passengers caught below in the hull drowned when the ship inevitably filled totally with water. A few hundred people now clung desperately to the side of the ship, exposed totally to the storm. Now, all they could do was try to wait to outlast it. Chief Mate Guthrie recalled, "As the day broke, we found the stern of the vessel washed in, and numerous dead bodies floating around the ship, some banging up on the rocks. Several of the passengers and crew, about 200 altogether, were still holding onto the vessel, the sea breaking over and every wave washing some of them away." Incredibly, they clung on from 5 a.m. when Cataraqui rolled to 4 in the afternoon, with no hope of escape. To jump into the water would mean almost certain death because the seas were so high that you'd be ground hard into the rocks. Then, in the late afternoon, something horrifying began to happen. Cataraqui had been subjected to unbelievable stresses, withstanding the full force of thunderous ocean waves for hours. With a groan and a crack, the ship began to give way, and then she split in two. Immediately, around 100 survivors were thrown into the waves, and anybody left holding on huddled around on the remaining section of the ship. With the ocean surging around them, they attempted to fashion a buoy to float out to the shoreline, but it became tangled, and it broke up in the seas. Then the ship began to break up beneath their feet, even more, flinging more into the ocean until there was just one section of the ship's bow or front left poking out above the waves, with just 70 people left holding on. Unbelievably, this group clung onto the ship until daybreak the next morning, but when the sun rose, only 30 were left. A party, including one of the Dr. Carpenter brothers, attempted to set off in the only remaining lifeboat, but it was immediately capsized and they were all lost. Then the bow section began to break up, and Cataraqui was finished. With only 20 left holding on for dear life, whatever ropes they'd fashioned to hold them to the wreck were undone to give them a final chance at life. Chief Mate Guthrie grabbed a plank of wood and plunged into the raging ocean. The plank helped carry him over the worst of the rocks, and he was somehow washed up alive on shore. He found another man, a passenger, who'd also miraculously survived, and then a smaller group of frightened, shivering crew. The survivors were tended to by a resident of the island who'd seen chunks of ship floating by and figured there had been a wreck. In the end, the survivors were stranded on the island for 5 weeks while the storm abated and a rescue could be organised. In total, 9 men, 8 crew and 1 passenger survived out of a total complement of 423 souls, and not a single woman or child made it. At the very moment Cataraqui was breaking up on the rocks, on the other side of the world, a different ship was being built. SS Birkenhead was a Mersey-built steamer launched just 2 months after Cataraqui was lost. In late February 1852, she was steaming nicely through the calm waters off Western Cape, South Africa. The sea was still, the conditions clear, basically perfect weather for any ship's crew. On board the ship were about 640 men, women and children, including around 500 British soldiers, drawn from 10 different regiments on their way to a remote colonial conflict. With little wind to fill their sails, most British ships of the time might have been in trouble, but not Birkenhead, because she had been the latest thing in technology. She was laid down in 1845 at the famous John Laird shipyard in England. Unlike Cataraqui, Birkenhead's primary method of propulsion was a pair of 564 horsepower steam engines that drove paddles on either side of the ship's hull. The ship was heavily laden down, with hundreds of passengers and crew and tons of stores and provisions packed into the hold. The 210-foot, 64-metre ship displaced around 2,000 tons. She'd originally been designed as a warship, a frigate, to be armed with old-fashioned cannons, but by this point ships had started to be built with iron hulls. Birkenhead was one of them. Now this was a strange era in ship design when some vessels used the latest technology and were simply too far ahead of their time. It was decided that Birkenhead would have more use as a troop ship because, at the time, Britain's empire was vast and spanned tens of thousands of miles. Birkenhead was called up to take troops from 10 different regiments, departing first from Portsmouth, where then she would steam for Queenstown near Cove, Ireland, then swing down for the Cape. Birkenhead would need to deposit many of the passengers and soldiers near Cape Town before then steaming on to deposit the rest of the reinforcements at Algoa Bay in Eastern Cape. Birkenhead set off and the trip was expected to take about a month. The ship was commanded by Captain Robert Salmond, a stern Scotsman of the Royal Navy, about whom relatively little is known. Aboard his ship were about 500 soldiers of regiments like the 2nd Queen's Surreys, the 12th Lancers, the 60th King's Royal Rifle Corps, even the 73rd Foot Regiment, now better known as the Black Watch, under the watchful eye of 2 senior officers, Captain Edward Wright and Major Alexander Seaton. Seaton had never been on campaign, but Wright was a veteran. Birkenhead's voyage was marked almost from the start as a doomed venture when she was steaming straight into a terrifying gale which battered the ship and threatened to sink her. Fortunately, her paddles meant the ship could keep her bow pointed into the worst of the weather, and for the better part of 2 full weeks, Birkenhead battled the elements. When at last the storm cleared, it was obvious that the soldiers, many of whom had never even seen the sea, were effectively physically defeated by their brush with the ocean's might. You can only imagine the hellish conditions down below in the ship's dormitories, but still, Birkenhead chugged along bound for Africa. After more than a month of steaming, Birkenhead arrived on February 23rd at Simon's Bay, near Cape Town. Many soldiers who were too ill had to be disembarked, along with most of the women and children aboard. But little did they know that even though Birkenhead's ultimate destination at Algoa Bay was only a few days away, their leaving the ship would probably save their lives. With 640 still aboard, Birkenhead had resupplied and at last set out for Algoa Bay. Captain Salmond, likely frustrated by the delay caused by the huge storm, decided to maintain a course that hugged the coast, which would, in theory, get his ship to her destination sooner. Late at night, shortly before 2 a.m, the ship's leadsman took a depth reading which revealed 12 fathoms, 22 metres or 72 feet of water, beneath the ship. Now Birkenhead had something of a curious quirk. She'd actually been designed and built by a very capable shipbuilder, but government interference had dashed their original plans. Originally, Birkenhead would have sat quite evenly in the water with a draft of about 15 feet 9 inches or just under 5 metres, but the Admiralty had suggested that the shaft of the paddle wheels be moved further forward. Now this small change upset Birkenhead's trim and meant that she was actually quite bow heavy. It's not entirely certain if this impacted what happened to the Birkenhead that night, or if Salmond had just adjusted for this issue by loading his ship heavier further aft to ease the trim. But regardless, just after the leadsman took his depth reading, there was a sickening, grinding crunch as Birkenhead's heavy bow was ripped and torn by something in the water. Seemingly out of nowhere, an uncharted rock had torn into the ship's hull. The depth under keel had suddenly jumped from 22 metres, 72 feet, to just 2 fathoms, 3.7 metres, or only 12 feet beneath the bow. Because of her unusual trim, Birkenhead was likely down by the head. You wonder, if she'd been correctly trimmed, she might have just cleared the rocks by steaming over the top of it. That wasn't the only condition working against Birkenhead that night. The unusually calm weather meant there were no waves breaking on the base of the rock, or, if it was submerged by the tide, no telltale disturbed white water over the top of the shoal. Salmond, half-dressed, raced on deck and ordered the anchor deployed and the engines run astern to try to free his ship, but this move proved fatal. The best thing he could have done in a situation like that is probably to keep the ship grounded firmly on the rocks to prevent it from sinking in deeper water. But as Birkenhead worked herself free, the rocks tore even more of the hull open. For those on deck, it would have been evidenced by a grinding sensation underfoot, but down in the hull, it was very different. Men, soundly asleep, were awakened as thousands and thousands of gallons of water suddenly roared into their dormitories, and over 100 are estimated to have drowned where they slept. Birkenhead's iron hull had been cleverly divided into 8 watertight compartments, but the rocks tearing at the hull had opened almost all of them up to the ocean, and those that were originally watertight had been cut open to allow men to move more freely throughout the ship. It meant Birkenhead suddenly started to sink very quickly. With only a few meagre quarter boats available, it was clear there could be no hope of evacuating any significant portion of the ship's complement. In the bow, dozens of men quickly rushed to man the ship's pumps, discharging floodwater over the side. Clearly, it was a lost cause, but at least it would keep the ship afloat long enough to hopefully get some of the boats away. They were uncovered and rigged to the simple davits to be swung over the ship's side. Salmond ordered one of the marine drummers to beat to quarters, and slowly the soldiers, as well as the ship's own marines, gathered on deck. Paintings would go on to show them standing to attention in their immaculate red coats, but the truth was that most of them were barely dressed or wrapped in blankets because they'd been so hastily called out from down below. The ship's captain found Major Seaton and calmly asked if he would, quote, be kind enough to preserve order and silence among the men. With about 60 men at the pumps and 60 others working to free the lifeboats, the remainder were ordered to stand in rank at the stern with the hope that the bow would be raised somewhat by their weight. Lieutenant Colonel Seaton walked up and down the ranks. Even though he was an academic officer and had never seen combat, he knew that he had to keep his men in check. With a firm voice, he asked them to stay in place, and they dutifully followed his commands. In fact, there wasn't any noise save for the men toiling at the boats and the horses stamping their feet. This is when Salmond made history. As the soldiers stood unmoved on the ship's decks, now ominously tilting down by the head, the captain ordered the women and children into the boats. He was adamant there could be no panic, and the troops would not break file or rush the lifeboats. To their credit, the men simply stood and watched as the chaos began to unfold around them. Captain Salmond's plan had been for his ship to float free of the rock, and then either remain afloat long enough for help to arrive, or for the ship to be beached. The quarter boats were lowered over the side, and then loading got underway. First, one of the ship's cutters with about 7 women and 9 children. The boat was filled with other officers and men, and set out. So too did the next cutter and the ship's gig. In all, about 62 soldiers and 3 marines boarded the boats, along with a young officer and the ship's surgeon. Salmond then had the men frantically set to work on the boats kept atop the paddle box. They would be able to get more away to safety yet. But then, with the evacuation efforts properly underway and the men tearing at the paddle box boat tackles, the unthinkable happened. With their engines still running astern, 10 minutes after the original impact, Birkenhead impacted the bottom again, but this time it would prove fatal. The engine room was torn open and tons of water rushed in, dousing the boilers. The ship lurched heavily, but the soldiers still stood in their ranks. It was clear that she was doomed, and then the end came incredibly quickly. The hull was subjected to enormous forces. With a roar, the bow section, with dozens of men still inside trying to work the pumps, broke free from the stern, disintegrated and sank almost immediately. The decapitated ship lurched underfoot and threw many of the soldiers to the deck. Over their heads, the ship's tall funnel came down right on top of the starboard paddle box where the men were working to free the boats there. They were killed and the paddle box itself carried away by the wreckage. Captain Salmond knew the end had come, and he called out, "Save yourselves, all those who can swim, jump overboard and make for the boats. This is your only hope of salvation." But Seaton, overseeing his men, knew that a break in ranks would probably end in disaster. Even as Birkenhead's decks began to be swallowed by the ocean, he shouted, "The cutter with the women and children will be swamped. I implore you not to do this thing, and I ask you to stand fast." Amazingly, the men listened, and only 3 broke their ranks. This display of discipline can only have come from the years of harsh drill and military training that taught men to stand firm in the face of cavalry attacks or volleys of gunfire and canister shot. But it must have been more than that. These hundreds of men were now faced with almost certain death, but they barely moved, even as the water swirled wide around their feet. A survivor, Captain Edward Wright of the 91st, wrote, "The order and regularity that prevailed on board from the time the ship struck until she totally disappeared far exceeded anything that I thought could be effected by the best discipline." And it is the more to be wondered at, seeing that most of the soldiers were but a short time in the service. Everyone did as he was directed, and there was not a murmur or cry amongst them until the ship made her final plunge. I could not name any individual officer who did more than any other. All received their orders and had them carried out as if the men were embarking instead of going to the bottom. There was only this difference, that I never saw any embarkation conducted with so little noise or confusion. Attempts at lowering one of the other paddle box boats, probably on the port side, failed when a line gave way and it tumbled into the sea. Finally, about 20 minutes after the initial impact, the end came for Birkenhead. The stern section dropped, the men were gradually swallowed up by the boiling waters, and Seaton's last cry was, "God bless you all." He was never seen again. It was over 2 miles, or about 3.3 kilometers to shore, and most of those men had no experience with water whatsoever. It was only then, once they were in the water, that the panic came, and shouts and screams echoed in the night. But almost as soon as Birkenhead disappeared beneath the waves, an eerie silence once again fell over the scene. Those who couldn't swim were drowned, but many banded together to attempt the Herculean 2-mile swim to shore. They never tried to swarm the lifeboats. Amazingly, dozens of men actually made it and landed, exhausted, on the shore, having had to battle their way in the final short stretch through thick seaweed that pulled many down. Around 50 reached landfall, but around them as they had swum, dozens more of their comrades and friends met their end, thanks to sharks. They came out in their dozens and attacked the men in the water. The ship's boats banded together through the night and then, the next day, attempted their own landings on the rocky shoreline. Sadly, had more senior officers survived in the boats, a nighttime landing could have been possible, and more in the water might have been saved, ferried to and from the shore throughout the night. But as it was, the early morning daylight revealed a scene of carnage and chaos. Bodies and wreckage floated in the waves. At the shore, the men who had successfully landed recovered other pieces of the ship which men had tied themselves to try to survive the night, but nearly all of them were dead. The paddlebox boat, which had dropped into the sea, eventually came ashore with some men alive and clinging to it. The next day, a small sailing schooner named Lioness reached the wreck site and found 40 or so men still alive, clinging to the ship's rigging, which still jutted high out of the water. They had survived the night and were taken aboard safely. Locals were alerted by a party of survivors who'd swum ashore. They managed to gather their strength and trudged 9 miles inland without shoes to raise the alarm. A whaleboat eventually plucked more survivors out of the water, some of whom had drifted for 38 hours. For days afterwards, boats patrolled the rocks and the shore to search for survivors, but it was clear the death toll had been immense. Of the 640 odd who'd been aboard, only about 190 were left alive to tell the tale. Captain Salmond had been spotted in the water, but it's thought a piece of wreckage came down on him and he was knocked unconscious and drowned. None of the senior officers, including Seaton, survived. They had been preoccupied to the last by keeping their men in order. The last request for the men to stay in place as Birkenhead broke up and sank had been just that, a request and not an order. The men had obliged and the boats had got away safely because of it. The news caused an absolute sensation, first in Britain and then the world. The fact that these men had stood so calmly in the face of certain death appealed to a certain sense of Victorian dutifulness. Less praised was the captain and crew of Birkenhead. Salmond had been running his ship extremely close to the shore, but he was not on watch when the ship had struck the reef. The initial depth sounding should have served as a warning that something dangerous was ahead, but the course was kept. Some of the crew were called before a trial, but any charges of negligence were dismissed because the captain and the senior officers had been lost. What the Birkenhead disaster did was cement the idea of women and children first in the public's mind. That was how men should behave in a disaster, it was decided. any break from that kind of stoicism would be cowardice. The praise for the Birkenhead soldiers approached mania, and in the end, the practice of standing aside so women and children could escape even became known as the Birkenhead drill. These kinds of stories, and there are dozens and dozens just like them, aren't stuck in the public imagination like Titanic or Lusitania. They exist now kind of like footnotes in history, but it's amazing to think that once, not really too long ago at all, it was the kind of thing people regularly just faced trying to settle in a new life in a new country. The Oceanliner really changed all of that, especially as they got bigger and safer. You'll probably enjoy our video on the evolution of Oceanliner, which I'll link if you enjoyed this video. At last, it seemed like humans had triumphed. Except, of course, we were then cruelly reminded that actually nature is always boss.